want you to think back to like a recent gift that you've got. Maybe it's a gift that you got over Christmas or your birthday. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I get those gifts and I'm kind of tempted to almost forget about the person that gave me the gift, right? It's like you're so excited about the gift you just got that you completely forget that someone took the time, the effort, spent the money to actually give you that gift. Even with my kids, I've got a couple of kids, and anytime they get a gift, we have to remind them. We say, hey, girls, what do you say? What do you say to your friends? What do you say to your grandmom? You know, and we try to teach them that common courtesy. But, you know, they say, oh, thank you, grandmom, thanks to my friend. But then they immediately go back, and they're so fired up about the gift, they forget the person that gave it to them. And now, in this series, we're basically going to be looking at some of the gifts that God gives us. Okay, that in life, God gives us a lot of privileges, a lot of opportunities, a lot of things that I think we could rightly call gifts. But sometimes we can fail to appreciate those gifts because we don't understand maybe why God gave them to us or kind of God's intent and purpose behind it. Or sometimes we can be so excited about the gifts that God gives us that we kind of forget about Him. Okay, and that's kind of why we're calling this series Gift or God. You know, because as God gives us these gifts, we have to ask the question, what's more important? You know, the gift that God gives us or the person, God Himself, that actually gave it to us. And so for the next month, we're going to look at some of those gifts, some of those privileges that God gives us. And the first one that we're actually going to look at tonight is this gift that God gives us of relationships and sex. And so, hey, if you didn't know what you're coming to tonight, we're going to have a fun time. We're going to talk about relationships and sex tonight. Maybe you didn't think, hey, you're coming to something, a meeting where we talk about faith, and we're actually going to talk about sex. And so we're going to see how those two things actually come together. And so with that, I want you to think way back to when you first began to learn about relationships and sex. You know, we used to call it back in the day the birds and the bees, right? And so I want you to think back and turn to maybe 2 or 3 people around you right now and discuss at what age did you learn about the birds and the bees? And how did you learn about it? Okay, how old were you? And how did you actually begin to understand sex and understand the birds and the bees? So take about a minute and discuss that with each other. Okay, we'll bring it all back together. Now, how many of you all learned about the birds and the bees? How many of y'all learned about it from your friends? Okay, so just kind of talking with your friends. How many of y'all learned about it like at school, like through some like formal class or program or something like that? You did, okay. How many of y'all learned about it just from like TV, you know, or some sort of media or something? Okay, how many of you all, one of your parents like had the talk? Okay, some of y'all had, your parents had the talk? Okay, well, I mentioned earlier, here's a picture of my family. Here's my wife, Jennifer. We've been married for about 17 years, and here's a picture of my 2 daughters. And so they are 10 years old and 8 years old. And we kind of decided when they were really young that instead of having the talk, what we would do with them is we would just kind of make it an ongoing dialogue. Okay, we didn't just want it to be just this one big conversation at a certain age, but we just said, hey, let's just make this an open topic. Let's make it something that we can discuss through kind of the different stages of life and even kind of help them to understand it almost progressively, right? And so we can kind of unfold it over the years. And so over these last several years, we've been having a lot of these talks kind of about the birds and the bees with our girls. And our girls kind of have 2 different reactions to it. Okay, one of our daughters, every time we bring it up, okay, the first thing she does, she's like, Dad, this is awkward. Dad, this is really weird. Dad, I don't want to talk about this. I'm like, okay, we're gonna talk about it. This is important, you know, for you to learn about it. And she's the same daughter. Like anytime I kind of give my wife a kiss and hug her, you know, the first thing she does, she just kind of does this. You know, she wants nothing to do with it. She just thinks it's awkward, it's weird, you know, the whole nine. Now, my other daughter, though, is the exact opposite. You know, anytime we bring it up with her, she's fascinated with it. You know, she's like, man, I want to know more. I want to know more. I want to know more. Same way when I like kiss my wife or give her a hug or something like that, she just gets glued. And she's like, Dad, do it again. You know? And so I've kind of got 2 like opposites, you know, with these 2 girls. One thinks the whole topic of relationships and sex is really awkward and weird. The other one is just fascinated with it, okay? And I don't know which is better, you know, or which is worse when it's all said and done, but that's just kind of my reality. And you all will be there someday, you know. You'll have kids of your own, and you'll have to figure out how do we navigate through this type of conversation. Now, my daughter who's fascinated with, there's an interesting incident. This was a few months ago. Jenna, one of my daughters, was out of town, so it was just me and one of my daughters, and I had like a phone appointment that was going to last like an hour. And so I told her, I said, hey, Dad's going to be on the phone for about an hour. You're just going to have to entertain yourself. You're going to have to grab some books. You're going to have to read a little bit. And she's like, that's okay. She loves reading. Our kids read hours, every day. And so I'm on this phone call, and at one point I walk by the couch, and she's just kind of propped up, legs kicked up, and she's reading a book. And I kind of noticed, it's like, man, I wonder what book she's reading. I actually brought it with me tonight. This was the book. This, again, remember, this is the one that's kind of fascinated with the topic. The book's called How Are Babies Made? And she's just there kind of relaxing, and it's just kind of reading it. And so I get off the phone call, and I'm like, hey, tell me about what you're learning. What are you reading? This is one of these books that we had shown her before. And she was just checking out. And this was actually the page that she was on. And so I sat down with her, and we just have this discussion. If this page doesn't make sense to you at face value, we'll have kind of an optional second seminar in the next room after this meeting's over. If this whole topic is new to you. But my girl, she was reading this page. You can see there the egg, you see the sperm. I'm going to kind of zoom in on it. You got this egg there saying, yoo-hoo, over here. And then you've got the sperm saying, hey, come on, there's the egg, and it's kind of a race to see who's going to get there. And we had a good conversation about this. And here's the reality. I want my girls to understand it, right? I know somehow they're going to learn about the birds and the bees. They're going to learn about it from TV. They're going to learn about it at school. They're going to learn about it from their friends. But as their parents, we think it's an important topic, so important that we want them to learn about it from us. We want it to be an ongoing dialogue that we get to have with our kids. But at least at this stage, again, for one of our daughters, it's kind of weird. It's kind of awkward. For the other one, it's kind of fascinating. Now, I say all that just to say, even as we think about this topic tonight and as we breach it tonight, man, some of you all might be in each of those two categories. It's like, man, I can't believe we're talking about this. This is kind of weird. This is kind of awkward that we're going to talk about relationships. We're going to talk about sex. In here, for some of y'all, maybe that's kind of a cool thing. It's fascinating. You're kind of curious, hey, what all does God actually have to say about it? And my hope tonight is for us to understand the gift that relationships and sex really is, to have a better understanding of God's purpose in it, but also to realize that as good as this gift is, it can never take the place of God in our life. The gift can't become more important to us than God himself. And so we want to rightly understand God's heart, God's design, and God's plan behind it. Now, when we think about our culture right now, this isn't like a new topic. If you think about it, all around our culture, relationships and sex is everywhere. There's not anywhere you go, anything you do where this isn't a major theme. And so we're constantly exposed to it. We're constantly thinking about it. But the question is, are we thinking rightly, about it? But let me just kind of give you some examples of the way that I see it kind of around us day in and day out. The first one is just, man, when I think about relationships and sex, it's something we write about. It's something we read about all the time. If you go to any bookstore, I can guarantee you the biggest section in those bookstores will be the sections that are devoted to relationships and sex. It always just has the largest volume of any books that are out there. If you go to your grocery store right now, this is the Dillons from this week, and you look at all the magazines right there beside the checkout line, what you're going to find on all of those magazines, the main topic is the topic of relationships. It is the topic of sex, And so this is something we write about all the time. It's something we read about all the time. It's really kind of in the forefront of our culture. And not only do we write about it, but we think about it. Psychologists would say that relationships and sex are some of the most powerful driving forces in us, and in the way that we think and in the way that we operate. Okay, so it's something we write about. It's also something that we think about. Thirdly, it's something that we watch. You can't watch, any TV or movies today and not see relationships and sex as a major theme. Matter of fact, the State University of New York recently did a research project, and they said that 2/3 of kind of nightly television all have sex as one of the major, if not the major theme of that sitcom or of that TV show. Again, it's just kind of around us. It's kind of the culture that we live in, the water that we swim in. Fourthly, is this something we sing about? We sing about it. If you were to, that same State University of New York study said that 92% of all the Billboard songs that are out right now have as a main focus of the song the theme of relationships and sex. And I was kind of curious. I wanted to kind of test the waters on this. So even this week, I got on the Billboard Top 100. I just wanted to look at the top 10 songs. And here was the top 10 songs, or some of the top 10 songs that are happening right now. And these are probably songs that maybe you're familiar with, at least some of them, if not all of them. And every one of these either has relationships and sex as the main thrust or kind of the main emphasis of the song, or it's at least a common lyric, throughout one of the stanzas, one of the chorus, or something like that. So these are some in the top 10. So first song, I think it's number 1 right now, Girls Like You by Maroon 5 and Cardi B. Juice WRLD has a song called Lucid Dreams, that's out right now. Marshmello's song, Happier, maybe a song you're familiar with. Post Malone, Better Now. Youngblood, 5 Seconds of Summer. DJ Snake, Cardi B, Selena Gomez. Taki Taki is a song right now. Travis Scott has Sicko Mode, which is a song right now. Magic in the Hamptons by Social House and Lil Yachty right now. And so again, these are just some of the top 10 songs right now. Did I mispronounce that? Oh, I got it? Okay, hey, got lucky, right? So, but all these songs, just part of the major thrust of them is relationships and sex. Okay, again, it's something that's all around us. It's just something that we write about, we think about, we watch, we sing about, and at the end of the day, it's something that's really common. It's something we do. Okay? Our culture is one of the most sexually driven cultures anywhere in the world. And the statistics kind of back that up. Over the last handful of years, I've had a lot of opportunities to travel in different places about the world. And one of the questions that I ask people in different countries that I go to is, hey, what's your perception of America? What do you think of America? And almost without exception, the way people view America is simply this. You got a lot of money, you play a lot of sports, and you have a lot of sex. That's the American stereotype. You got a lot of money, you play a lot of sports, and you have a lot of sex. You see, our reputation, even in kind of the global scope, is a reputation of a country and a culture that is really kind of consumed with or saturated with the topic of sex. And for all of these reasons, I think it's an important topic for us to think about tonight. An important topic for us to consider, hey, does God have something to say about this? Now, for most of us, we might think, man, God and sex, those things just don't go together, right? And I would argue it couldn't be further from the truth. That when we actually look at what the Bible has to say about sex, we see that it's a significant theme throughout the Bible. That God is actually the one who invented relationships. That relationships were God's idea. That sex is God's idea. And throughout the Bible, you see that God has a lot to say about relationships and about sex because it's a gift. It's something that's important to God. It's something that's valuable to God. It's something that's special to God. And He wants us to understand it and to understand it rightly. Okay, matter of fact, there's one entire book of the Bible. It's called the Song of Solomon. And that book in the Bible is completely devoted to a man and a woman who are attracted to each other, who pursue one another, who come into a relationship with one another. And the whole rest of the book is about their sex life. And it talks about it in a pretty explicit type manner. And what's cool is that when God describes it this way, He's not like doing it in some taboo or shameful type way. God is saying, man, this is what it's meant to be. Okay, I've created it with this in mind. This idea of relationships and sex, it's a gift, that I've created and that have an amazing plan and an amazing purpose for. And so tonight, I want us just to, in some small way, kind of breach the topic. And just to begin to introduce some of the amazing things that God has to say about relationships and sex and really their potential in our lives and really His purpose, behind it as well. Now in February, we're going to probably come back around Valentine's Day. We'll probably devote a couple more weeks to the topic and take it a little bit deeper, but tonight I just kind of want to introduce it as we think about this series of gift or God. So if you got your handouts, there's basically 4 points that I want us to think about tonight. 4 things that will help us understand this gift that God has for us. And the first one is this. It's that God designed relationships and sex to be an amazing gift. To be an amazing gift. Now, again, when I think about most of my life, how I viewed this whole topic of God and sex, I kind of thought, man, God's just got a bunch of rules. Okay? And I thought, man, the Bible, I had never read it, but I just assumed it gave a bunch of rules. And honestly, that was one of the reasons why I was kind of, for the first 19 years of my life, I wasn't interested in God, I wasn't interested in faith, I wasn't interested in church, because my whole perception of it was that it was just a bunch of rules. And my stereotype of religion was that it was just a bunch of things that you weren't allowed to do. It's like, man, don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this. But then it also had this other set of rules that you had to do. You have to do this, you have to do this, you have to go here, you have to act like this, etc. And for me, because I only saw this whole notion of God as a list of rules of things that you can't do and things that you have to do, I kind of dismissed it and just kind of said, hey, that's not for me. Because I know that my life looks a lot more like the can't do list than it does like the have to list. And I just assumed, man, me and God, me and faith, me and religion, those two just don't go together. But when I was in college, I was 19 years old, and I actually had a good friend. Okay, and this friend was kind of the first person that I ever got to know who, for him, his faith was really an authentic thing. It wasn't just a list of rules, but it was something that was really real to him. It was something that was really personal to him. And man, just through our friendship, we began to read the Bible together. For me, it was kind of the first time. And I began to understand more of who God really was. And one of the things I discovered about God as I started reading the Bible for the first time is that God wasn't primarily preoccupied with rules and giving us rules for our life. But God was more concerned with us as people. He was concerned with bringing us back into a right relationship with Him. God was concerned with transforming our hearts and our lives, but doing that from the inside out, not just by instilling a bunch of rules or morality of how we should live. And this, again, broke my stereotype. Man, God's not just about giving us a bunch of rules, but God really is about helping us become the kind of men and women that He created and that He intended for us to be. And Jesus' whole life and death on the cross occurred in order to make that possible. And so I began to understand God differently. I began to understand faith differently. I began to understand, man, this is significant. This is important. And I began to realize that it's real. And as I began to grow in my faith, while I was in college as a 19-year-old, 20-year-old, and so on, the thing that I began to realize is as I looked at these different areas of life, it was the same way. It wasn't that God just had a bunch of rules, but that God had an amazing purpose and an amazing plan to all of these areas. One of those being the area of relationships and sex. And so tonight, I want to just kind of start out by helping us realize when we think about this topic, what I'm not going to give you is a bunch of rules tonight, because I don't think we find a bunch of rules, if you will, in the Bible. But what we are going to see is that God intended for relationships and for sex to be an amazing gift. One place I want to begin to look to see this is in the very beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis. Genesis, that word means beginnings. And so when you get to chapter 1 in Genesis, what God describes is the beginning of the universe. When you get to chapter 2, He describes the beginning of humanity. And so in Genesis chapter 2, we're kind of introduced to the first man and the first woman. And as the kind of the text goes, in Genesis chapter 2, God creates Adam first. He creates this man. And as we read those first few verses in Genesis 2, what we notice is that Adam and God have a perfect relationship. There's this spiritual union between Adam and God. God has a great purpose for Adam's life. He's got a role. He's got a significant responsibility in the universe. And the idea that the Bible paints is that Adam is perfectly content, perfectly happy, that him and God have a perfect relationship, and everything is going great. But at some point, God comes up to Adam, and we don't know if this is 10 days after He made him or 10 years after He made him, but God comes up to Adam, and He says to him, He says, you know what, Adam? I don't think it's good for you to be alone. And now, from the second chapter of the Bible, we see this idea of relationships being introduced. And guess what? It wasn't mankind's, or it wasn't humanity's idea. The person who came up with the idea of relationships was God. God comes up to Adam and says, hey, Adam, it's not good for you to be alone. I'm going to make you a suitable helper. I'm going to make a companion for you to do life with, to have this relationship with me with, to have purpose and meaning with. And so Adam, again, he's not out looking necessarily and it has a sense of being incomplete, but God says, you know, I think you're incomplete. And I want you to have what we're later going to find out as a wife. But relationships, as it begins, starts with God seeing that this is a need for all of us. So relationships don't begin with us, they begin with God. And so the Bible teaches us from there on, God puts Adam to sleep. He actually forms and fashions a woman, and then Adam wakes up and God brings this woman to him. Her name is Eve. And I want us to read the response that Adam, kind of what he says in Genesis chapter 2 when God kind of introduces this first man and this first woman to each other. Adam says this, and it's kind of a poetic type statement. He says, hey, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. Now, what Adam is saying here, again, it's kind of a poetic way, but he's looking at her. And keep in mind, all Adam at this point has seen is a bunch of animals and God. And none of those look like him. But now all of a sudden he looks at this woman. He says, wait a second, she is bone of my bone, she's flesh of my flesh. And that's kind of a poetic way of saying, you know what, she looks like me. Now, obviously, she looked a little bit different, than he did, but he's like, that we go together here. And he says, she was taken out of me in a sense. She used to be called woman. She was taken out of man. And so it's as if Adam, basically in a poetic way, says, God, we belong together. Me and her, we go together. You've made us to go together. You made us for this relationship. And God's like, yeah, exactly. I came to the conclusion that it wasn't good for you to be alone. And so I made someone to bring together with you. I created the first relationship, God says to Adam. And then we see as the text goes on, it says this, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, and he'll be united with his wife. And they will become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. So not only here do we see basically the first relationship, but we also see the first marriage, and we see the first example of sex anywhere in the Bible. And notice again that it's presented here as an amazing gift. This relationship was God's idea. Sex was God's idea. Marriage was God's idea. And the picture that's painted here is you kind of have this man, and you've got kind of all of who he is. He's a physical being, he's a spiritual being, he's an emotional being, he's a sexual being. And then you have this woman that God creates who has kind of a physical aspect of her, an emotional aspect, a sexual aspect, and a spiritual aspect. And God says, man, my plan, my perfect design and gift that I want to create is where this guy and the physical man he is, spiritual, emotional, sexual, and this woman come together. And the Bible says that they would become one flesh, that there's this union that takes place, in this marriage that is a physical union. In other words, there's commitment there. There's a spiritual union because God is the center of both of their lives. There's an emotional union because their hearts come together and they connect with one another in a sense of companionship, for the sake of their lives. But then there's also this sexual union that takes place. And God says, man, that's the gift. That's what I created it to be. And you look at the result of this union where this man and woman come together physically, emotionally, spiritually, and sexually. We see the result. It says that he and his wife, they were naked and there was no shame. You see, that's God's beauty and his plan behind relationships and sex. That it would be a beautiful thing. That there would be no shame. That there would be no regret. There would be no pain. There would be no heartbreak behind it. You see, God intended for sex and for relationships to be a great and amazing gift for us to enjoy. Now that's God's design. That's his plan. But if we look around our society, we look around our world, honestly, if we think about it, we see something a lot different than that. Than this cool kind of union, of people physically, emotionally, spiritually, and sexually. Because our culture's primary approach to relationships and sex can basically be characterized by, kind of this pattern. This pattern that basically says, hey, you hook up, you shack up, you break up, and then you repeat. And then it starts all over again. You hook up, you shack up, you break up, and you repeat. And all along the process, there's more pain, more regret, more disappointment, And the reality is, man, even though that's the normal path that we go down, God has intended and makes it possible for all of us to have something better. He wants us to have this amazing gift. And that kind of brings us to our second point, is that even though God has an amazing gift of relationships and sex, we tend to distort God's gift of relationships and sex. We tend to distort it. Now, by distort it, let me give you kind of two ways that I think we can distort what God's design is for relationships and sex. The first way we can distort it is we can make too much of it. We can make too much of relationships and sex and actually make it a God, which is kind of what our series is talking about. And so what I mean here is relationships and sex can become so important to us that they become our everything. That it actually begins to take the place of God in our life. Think about it. This would kind of be the attitude of someone that just says, hey, you know what? I just can't live without him. I just can't live without her. My whole life revolves around her. My whole life revolves around him. He's everything to me. She's everything to me. When someone has that attitude, again, towards relationships or towards sex, what you really see is that they've almost made too much of it. And the whole idea, this gift that God's given us, isn't just appreciated, but it's exaggerated to where it becomes everything to us. And in a sense, in that case, relationships and sex almost becomes like God to us. It becomes the most important thing in our world, and our entire identity is wrapped up in that guy. Our entire identity is wrapped up in that girl. And that's a distortion of God's gift. It's a distortion of God's plan. So that's one side, one way we can distort it. But the second way we can distort it is not by making too much of relationships and sex, but it's by doing the opposite. Because we can also distort kind of God's gift to us if we make too little of a deal of sex and we simply reduce it to an appetite that's meant to be satisfied. And I think this is in some ways what we do in our culture. It's not that we think too highly of relationships and sex, but it's almost that we don't think of it high enough. And we see relationships and sex as just an appetite that I need to satisfy. And so again, emotionally, I'm feeling lonely. And so, the whole hookup culture is, man, I just need something to kind of make me feel better. It's just, I have this emotional appetite that I need satisfied, or I have this sexual appetite that I just want satisfied, And so if we just hook up, then, man, I'll feel better, at least for a day. I'll just appease the appetite, for maybe a day, maybe a month, maybe a year. But I don't really care about the person. I don't really care about the commitment. This whole idea of, man, God's design and his plan, for this physical, emotional, spiritual, and sexual union, I don't think of it that highly, but it's just about feeling good. That's kind of what our hookup culture really does. It just thinks too little of sex. It thinks too little of relationships and actually causes them to crumble. The whole porn industry, I think, is a reflection of this. A lot of times we think of pornography and kind of just how widespread it is, and we think, man, it's because we're just so consumed. We think way too much of sex. Well, I would argue I think it does the opposite. Just the epidemic of pornography in all of our culture doesn't exist because we think too highly of sex and relationships. It's because we think too low of it. And we don't appreciate it. We don't value it the way that God created it to be. And so that appetite just has to be fed over and over and over, because guess what? No matter how much you get entrenched within it, it never satisfies, which is why it's the most growing industry anywhere in the world right now. You realize that pornography just last year actually made more money across the globe than professional baseball, professional basketball, professional football, professional hockey, and professional soccer combined. It made more money than all of those things combined. 2018, the pornography industry also made more money than Microsoft, Apple, Yahoo, eBay, Google, Earthlink, and Amazon combined. That's the reality of how much the appetite is craved for sex and relationships. It's hands down the biggest industry, the biggest money maker anywhere in the world, and it's not even close. Who's second? Why is that? Is it because we think too highly of sex and relationships? I would say no. I think it's because we don't think highly of it enough, and we don't see the amazing gift that God intended for it to be. Third point is this. Not only did God design relationships and sex to be an amazing gift, and do we tend to distort that gift, but thirdly, God gives directions and boundaries with this gift. The Bible does say that God has a plan. He has a purpose. He does give direction. He does give some boundaries for it. But I would argue this is when God gives us direction and God gives us boundaries, it's because he cares. It's because he loves us. Think about, driving, or think about any sport, or think about music, or think about anything. Having directions and having boundaries is a good thing. Can you imagine playing a sport without any sense of direction or without any boundaries to it? The whole sport itself would crumble. Can you imagine trying to go somewhere if you didn't have any direction or if you didn't have any boundaries? It would ultimately destroy itself. And the same is true with relationships and sex. As God does give us instruction, he does give us some boundaries, okay? But we tend to think, well, God, you're giving those to oppress us. And I don't think it's that way at all. When I think about God's boundaries and God's directions, here's kind of the reason why God gives us boundaries and directions when it comes to relationships and sex. First of all, it's for our protection. It's for our protection. The boundaries and directions that God gives us in relationships and sex is to protect us so that we don't destroy our lives. We don't destroy relationships. I'll give you an example. These are my two girls again. So my 10-year-old and my 8-year-old. Now, I love these girls more than anything in the world, other than my wife, okay? I would die 10,000 deaths for these two girls, okay? I love them. Well, guess what? Because I love them, guess what I do when I raise them? From the moment they've been born, I've been giving them direction. I've been giving them boundaries. I've been telling them, hey, girls, this is something you can touch. This is something you can't touch. This is something you can eat. This is something you shouldn't eat. This is someplace you can go. This is someplace you can't go. This is something you can do. This is something you can't do. This is something you can watch. This is something you shouldn't watch, and so on. Now, why do I do that? Am I trying to oppress my kids? Am I trying to make their life dull and boring? Am I trying to hinder them from experiencing life to the fullest? Or am I trying to raise them in a way that will help them actually to have life to the fullest? You see, because I love my girls, I give them boundaries. Because I love my girls, I give them direction. And I'm doing that because I want to protect them so that they don't destroy their lives. When I was in high school, one of my best friends came from a home where his mom wasn't around. His dad was the vice president of a university and was just kind of consumed with life and responsibilities. And his dad's philosophy on parenting was basically no direction and no boundaries. Okay? He literally gave him no direction, no boundaries anywhere in life. Okay? Now, at the time in high school, I thought this was cool. To me, that was the cool dad, that my friend had. Because anytime we wanted to party, guess where we partied? We partied at Jimbo's house. His dad's name was Jim. We called him Jimbo. So we go over to Jimbo's house. All right? Anytime we needed kegs, guess who bought them for us? Jimbo always have a couple kegs, every weekend for us. Anytime we wanted weed, guess who would get it for us? Jimbo had his connections, and Jimbo would provide for us. And so we all thought through high school, man, he is the coolest dad in the world. He gives no direction. He gives no boundaries. We can go over to his house, and we can do anything and everything we want, completely free, And what's crazy is now 20 years later, I've seen the result in my friend's life and in his sister's life of being raised in an environment that had no direction, had no boundaries. What seemed so cool at the time, do you know what I realize now? Man, it wasn't love at all. It didn't liberate Jimbo's kids. What it did is it destroyed them. And their lives today are a reflection of the lack of direction and the lack of boundaries that their dad actually gave. It seemed so cool at the time for them to not have boundaries and to not have direction. But it ultimately didn't make their lives flourish. It made their lives crumble. And you see, God is the same way for us. He gives us direction. He gives us boundaries. But it's because He cares about us and because He wants to protect us so that we don't destroy our lives. Proverbs 1:32 and 33 says this. It says, "For the waywardness of the simple will kill them." Simple here means just someone who doesn't know any better. So it says, someone who doesn't know any better, the way that they live, the choices they make, if they don't know any better, ultimately, it'll kill them. And the complacency of fools will destroy them. A fool is different than a simple person. A simple is a person is referring to someone who doesn't know any better. A fool is someone who knows what's right, but who chooses not to do it. Look what it says. The result's the same. The waywardness of the simple will kill them. The complacency of fools will destroy them. But, now look at the contrast. But whoever listens to wisdom will live in safety, will be at ease, and without fear of harm. You see, to have instruction, to have boundaries in life, it protects us from destroying our lives. It protects us from ruining our lives. And instead, it helps us to live in safety, to have ease, to not have any fear of harm. Yes, God gives boundaries. Yes, God gives direction in our relationships and in our sex lives, but it's because, first of all, He wants to protect us. Second thing, though, is God doesn't just give boundaries, and direction in order to protect us, but He also gives it to us for enhancement. For enhancement. What I mean by this is that God's direction and boundaries keep us from destroying sex. Keep us from destroying sex. Would you believe that the people with the best and most satisfying sex lives are people that are happily married and faithful to one another? Would you believe that? Every sociological study, every legitimate sociological study, without exception, that's been done over the past 50 years will come to that conclusion. Hands down, the people with the best sex life, the people who are the most satisfied with their sexuality, are people who are happily married and are faithful to one another. The science will prove it every single time. It's true. You see, God's boundaries and directions don't only protect us from destroying our lives, it helps us to experience God's plan and God's gift of sex and relationships to the fullest. I remember it's like a few years ago, I had a kind of a guy that was kind of a mentor to me. He was 86 years old, okay, at the time we had this conversation. He'd been married over 60 years. And we're just talking about life and everything else. And at one point, the topic of sex comes up, which is kind of an interesting topic to talk about with an 86-year-old. And he makes this comment to me. He says, Joel, he says, we've been married for over 60 years. Can I tell you something? And I'm like, what? He says, we're having the best sex that we have ever had in our life. And I'm like, you're kidding, right? And he's like, no. He's like, 60 years we've been married. Our sex has never been better than it is right now. You know? And he was being serious. Now, don't picture it in your mind, you know? But he was being serious. 60 years of marriage, 60 years of being faithful to his wife. The best sex he'd ever had. You know, God gives us direction. God gives us a sense of boundaries. But it's because he doesn't want us to destroy sex. And he realizes when we don't operate out of his directions and his boundaries, we actually destroy sex. Sociology says that. My friend says that. But also, one of the guys who has been more promiscuous than anyone else in the world, guess what? He says it too. Do y'all know who this is? This is Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt Chamberlain, he's not alive anymore, but he's one of the greatest basketball players to ever live. Wilt Chamberlain is kind of known for two things in his life. Number one, he's the only player in NBA history to score 100 points in a game. Can you imagine that? 100 points in an NBA game. No one did it beforehand, and in all likelihood, no one will ever repeat that feat. So he's known for that, 100 points in a game. Second thing that Wilt is known for is he claims that over the course of his life, he had sex with over 10,000 different women. 10,000 different women. And most people that knew him said, hey, that's a conservative estimate. He wrote a book about it, and he talks about, hey, this was his life. Sex for him was basically like a god. Everything he did, he said, was more important to him than basketball. And over the course of his life, he had sex with over 10,000 women. At the end of his life, he was being interviewed. And he was asked, hey, when you think about all of the sex that you had, you know, what did it mean to you? And I want you to just hear a quote that Wilt said at the end of his life after the breadth of sex that he experienced. He says this. He says, with all you men out there who think that having 1,000 different ladies is pretty cool, I have learned in my life that having one woman 1,000 different times is much more satisfying. You see, I don't think Wilt ever fully understood God's gift and God's design for sex. But you can see here that even at the end of his life, he's beginning to realize the truth of it more and more. That the most satisfying sex really is sex as God intended for it to be. The most satisfying relationships is relationships as God intended for it to be. Why does God give us direction? Why does God give us boundaries? He gives it to us, one, to protect us from destroying our lives, but two, he gives it to us for enhancement so that we also don't destroy sex. And God realizes that the best experience of his gift of relationships and sex is found, in our marriage, and is found in being faithful to our spouse. And this kind of brings us to our last point, and it's this. Hey, how do I pursue this gift as God meant for it to be? How do I pursue this gift as God meant for it to be? And real simply, I would say this, is we get to experience God's gift of relationships and sex really when we begin with us as an individual. And if you want to experience, God's ultimate plan and purpose for relationships and sex as he designed it to be, it begins with you and I starting out at a place where we make God the center of our lives. Before we can have this gift of God, before we can experience relationships and sex the way God meant it for it to be, we have to kind of come to a place where it's like, God, I want you to be the foundation of my life. We want God to be the center of our life. And then from there, we want God's purpose for our lives. God does have a purpose for us. And when we build a foundation in our lives where God is at the center of our lives, where his purpose is at the center of our life, then, this is where that beauty of God's plan for relationships and sex comes in. And it's as if, my life is built on God and his purpose, and then relationships, and my marriage someday is a person that God brings into my life that I get to pursue God and his purpose alongside. And I can really experience relationships to the full, and I can experience sex to the full. One way you've heard maybe people describe it is this way before. It's this idea of having God as your master, living for his mission, and then ultimately having a mate that God brings into your life to help you live for Him and His purpose for your life. And if we want to really experience the best of God's gift, it's when we can have relationships, when we can have a marriage, and when we can have sex that's built on this kind of foundation in our lives individually. Okay? So, just to kind of recap, tonight we talked a little bit about God's design for relationships and sex, that it was intended to be an amazing gift. We tend to distort it by making too much of it, making too little of it. We can God gives us directions and boundaries for that gift, for our protection, for our enhancement. But ultimately, we can pursue this gift as God meant for it to be when we learn to build our lives around God and His purpose for our lives. Now, to kind of flesh this out, make it a little more practical, I invited a couple of our newlyweds. They've been married a year and a half, so not exactly newlyweds yet, but invited them to come up. And I'm actually going to do a little bit of an interview with Alex and Anna Rebeck. So here's Alex, and here's Anna. So welcome them up. And I'm just going to ask them a couple of questions. About this topic, about this gift of relationships and sex. And so they're not perfectly newlyweds yet. Y'all been married a year and a half?
Yeah, about that.
Is that right? Okay.
I don't know the exact day, but
Okay, well, you should. Alex,
May
I don't either.
May
Okay,
12th
never
was the
mind.
day.
That's
Yeah.
okay. Well, first question. I've got maybe 4 for us, but y'all been married a year and a half. What surprised you all about marriage so far? Anything kind of been, out of the blue, surprising to you this last year and a half?
I don't know that a ton of things have been surprising, but we were actually talking, I guess, about this the other day. It's a little bit gross, maybe TMI. I don't know. I'll let you be the judge. But I've been surprised, Joel, by how fast my unibrow and nose hairs grow. And the reason why is because Anna points them out to me. And so
I feel like I should,
yeah, which I'm thankful. You'd be able to see them from here if she wouldn't. It's just like this enchanted forest coming out of my nose. At least the look on her face seems that way. So that's been a little bit surprising.
Perks of marriage.
Yeah, it's a good perk.
And anything for you?
Yeah, surprising. This is a pleasant surprise. He actually is the barista in our home. And so he makes
Baristo.
coffee.
Oh,
yeah,
guys, oh.
baristo. And so he makes coffee every morning. He brings me a cup of coffee every morning. So that's been a pleasant surprise.
Hand-delivered cup of coffee.
Man, what a servant. Hey, well, I know Alex and Anna, their story a little bit. And so during your college years, you all both grew a lot in your faith. And so as you were growing in your faith, our theme tonight, relationships and sex, how did your view of relationships and sex change during your college years as you were growing both in your faith?
I think I first kind of thought, kind of like what you talked about, Joel, I guess, was I thought God wasn't really about or into relationships. And then I kind of thought that God was a little bit like anti-sex. And in my mind, I don't know why, I kind of put it in the same category as like drugs and alcohol, like sex, drugs, and alcohol. I thought God kind of viewed it that way. He thought sex was a bad thing. He was anti, kind of like, you're anti-hazing. These hands don't haze. like these hands don't have sex. Like that's just what I thought. And so, but that was obviously a wrong view. And then secondly, I guess I just kind of had a self-centered view of relationships and of sex. And growing up, it's not like I was a terrible guy or anything, but my normal default was I just kind of always looked for relationships and sex kind of as what I could get out of it, and it was kind of a self-centered thing. How could this girl make me look good or make me feel good, or what could I get out of this situation? But then as I began to grow in my faith and I began to read the Bible in college, I began to see that God he wasn't anti-sex. Within the context of marriage, I began to learn that God was actually for sex. He was pro-sex within the context of marriage. He actually commands it. He says it's a good thing, a really good thing, right? Yeah, see, guys, good. Like eating your veggies, God commands married couples to have sex, and he said it's a good thing. And I didn't learn that until college. And then I also just began to learn God's kind of heart for relationships and marriage. And I kind of, as I began to read the Bible, I began to learn that what God says is a healthy marriage and a healthy relationship is a marriage or a relationship where each person is committed to the other person's best, and where each person is kind of looking to not what they can get or take, like I used to do, but where each person is kind of looking to what they can give toward the other person. And so that was just kind of new to me coming into college.
Cool.
Yeah, and I feel like initially for me, just the idea of relationships, it just was a big part of me and my friends' lives. It was what we talked about. It was kind of even how we made decisions of where we were going to go on the weekends. It was kind of just what we thought about, talked about, this guy or maybe the next guy, the hope of the next guy. And so I feel like it was just something that consumed even a lot of our time. And so I feel like as I began to grow in my faith, and I think I realized I was looking to those relationships with those guys just even to really satisfy kind of just this void or this kind of empty part of my life, and just hoping that would kind of meet the need. And so I feel like as I grew in my faith and grew in my relationship with God, and like we talked about tonight, I realized that relationships were still a gift. They were a really good thing, but I think I just had gotten it out of order. And so I think I realized that ultimately a relationship with God was the one that was going to satisfy the most, and even make every other relationship that I had even better if I continued to put God first and prioritize Him first.
Cool. This is kind of related to that same question, but even before you all kind of got to know each other, before you all started dating, anything like that, how did you begin to change the way you reviewed relationships and sex and begin to live that out? Kind of wanted to live God's design for it, even before you all basically met each other and got to know each other.
I guess I kind of originally thought that if I was to kind of try and do this thing God's way, or I guess trust God with it or whatever, I guess I kind of thought that God would give me a miserable marriage, or make me marry someone that I wasn't attracted to or didn't like. And I thought God would just kind of make me sign up for something miserable. Okay. And so I think what I first had to kind of do is just realize that God's not like that, and God's committed to our best. Okay. And He wants to enhance those types of things, the gifts in our lives. And so I think, one, I just had to get to a place to really trust God with it. And then it's not like growing up, I wasn't a ladies' man or anything like that. No, it wasn't. That's all right. I'll admit it. But I was always chasing some girl in some sort of way, or I was in a relationship or anything or something like that. And I kind of always just needed someone else to make me feel good, or to be happy, or to be satisfied. And so before Anna and I even met, to try to begin to do it God's way, I kind of just tried to get to this place where I could be cool with not always having to have somebody else to make me happy or make me satisfied, or to make me feel a certain way. But I tried to get to a place where I could just be cool with me and God. And so I didn't do it perfectly. There's ups and downs, but I tried to get to that place.
Cool.
Yeah, I think for me, I just began to, as I began to get to know God and just even realize, that God had some really neat even plans, I feel and purposes for my own life, and just even for who He wanted me to be as a person, just even my character and the way I treated people, the way that just even my priorities played themselves out. And so I think as I began to think about that, and I think even see all the kind of just even ways I could continue to grow in my relationship with God. And I think even when I thought long term, or just even kind of the guy that I wanted to end up with, just the different kind of attributes and characteristics I would want to be true of them, when I kind of flipped the script on myself, I realized that none of those things were actually true about me yet. And so I think just even right away, I just realized there was a lot of things that I could grow in, just my own character, who God had created me to be, and how I could just even embrace just God's plans and purposes for my life. So I just tried to do that, initially.
And I'm really grateful Anna did that, because now I reap the benefit and the reward of that in marriage, which is cool.
It is cool. I forgot to put your all's picture up, by the way, so there it is. Hey, one last question. Got to wrap it up. So y'all been married a year and a half now. So looking back, in hindsight, why are you glad that you kind of laid that foundation, like we were talking about, with your lives being built around God and His purpose for your lives, which is ultimately kind of the foundation for your marriage today? So why is it worth it, in doing it, kind of experiencing this gift the way God intended for it to be?
Yeah, so only a year and a half, so I wouldn't say we're quite experts yet. But I think that one thing, even in that year and a half, I've realized is just that there's so many just decisions that come along just when in marriage, and just things you communicate about. So I'm just really glad that a lot of the times we're just on the same page with that. Just that, not that we do it perfectly by any means, but I feel like as we both tried to have prioritize our relationship with God and try and live out God's purpose for us, it's been cool just to see that we can be on the same page in a lot of ways, and just even come to the same conclusions. And so I feel like that's just made even the first year and a half of marriage just even a lot of fun, and not totally easy, but I feel like easier since we are kind of on the same page in a lot of ways.
Yeah, being on the same page is crucial. And I think, so much of my life I just built relationships kind of on on shallow things, if you will, and that kind of always just led to, obviously, shallow relationships. And so what we're trying to do, Anna and I aren't doing it perfectly, but trying to build our relationship and our friendship and our marriage on God and on His purposes. If you think about a relationship with God and God's purposes, those aren't shallow things. Those are actually probably the two most deepest, richest, satisfying things in the world. And so when we trying to build our relationship and our marriage on those things, that hasn't led to a shallow marriage, but actually the exact opposite. That's led to a marriage that isn't perfect, but one that really is deep, rich, satisfying, and fulfilling. And so trying not to build on shallow things, but the richness and the goodness of God and knowing Him and His purpose really has led to a full and satisfying marriage, a full and satisfying sex life. And I'm really thankful that I get to be married to Anna. So,
wow, that's awesome. Well, Alex, Anna, thanks a lot. Thanks for coming and sharing and give us a little snapshot of your lives and your marriage. Isn't that cool? Cool to hear. Man, I just love you in that last thought, which is really kind of what we're talking about tonight. It's that God does have this amazing gift for us. It's a rich gift. Relationships were intended to be rich. Your sex life was intended to be rich. And we really have a choice. Man, what will we do with this gift that God's given to us? Will we approach it, treat it in a shallow way? Will we kind of let it become God to us? Or will we see it for the gift that it really is? Appreciate the richness of God's plan and God's purpose, and therefore get to experience that richness in our relationships and in our sex life. So again, the series, Gift or God. Do we understand God's gifts, or do we begin to actually prefer those gifts over God Himself rather than failing to experience those gifts as God intended for them to be? Here's what we're going to do tonight as we kind of wrap up. The band's going to come up here in a few minutes, but I just want you to take a little bit of time and just think through what we talked about tonight. And so I've actually got a few discussion questions. They're on the bottom of your handout. They'll be up on the screen here. And so just take 4 or 5 minutes with a group of 2, 3, 4 around you right now, and just kind of think back to some of the things we've talked about and discuss these questions for a few minutes. And then again, here in a few, the band will come back up and they'll kind of wrap things up for us. Sound good? All right.